What we're going to talk about today is basically a bit about the structure of scientific communication. If I were to ask you what sort of sections you find in a paper, you'd probably quickly, as a class, be able to tell me, hey, we've got the introduction, we've got method section, we've got results, and we've got discussion. And then you also might throw in, okay, there's a few others, like abstract, references, acknowledgments. But those are the four biggies that we normally think of: the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. And it's not just in a paper. We use that structure in all forms of scientific communication, even if they're not necessarily labeled as such, right? So you find it in a paper, you'll find it in an oral presentation, and you'll find them in posters as well. So the question is, why? Why do we structure things this way? And I think that understanding the why helps you to figure out the flow that happens within a paper. And so what I'm going to tie it to is the process that we use in science, which, back in your lessons in elementary or middle or high school, they called the scientific method. And so when you had those lessons when you were a kid, they probably had a number of different steps. And of course, everyone phrases them a different way. But the ones that I remember were, you start out by asking a question, or sometimes this says stating a problem. Ask a question, and then you do some research, and then you form a hypothesis, right? And then you make observations, or you do experiments, right, depending on what your question is about. So experiment is something that I think about because I'm more of a chemist, and then biologists might actually be doing more observations. Then you analyze the data, then you draw a conclusion, and that's it, right? Well, of course, in the real world, even though we kind of go through this, a lot of times the conclusion that we draw at the end of an experiment is, wait, that's not really enough data. I'm not 100% sure. So we might actually have an arrow, which I forgot to put in here, that goes back to the observe/experiment thing. And then so we might go through where we're experimenting, analyzing data, thinking about the data, more experiments, more data, whatever. But a lot of times when we get to the end, even after we're completely satisfied with our data, a lot of the conclusions that we draw are, wait a second, this brings up another question, right? So we get into this big cycle where we're constantly drawing conclusions, and those bring up more questions. And so we have this cycle of going through. Now, there is a point at which we feel like we have enough data, we have justified our conclusions, and we kind of break out of this cycle temporarily to report what we've done to other people, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't go back and ask more questions. In fact, there's a part in the discussion where we talk about future work, and that is basically tying us into the next questions that people could address. But that's basically how we tackle things, right? And so the way that we set up our scientific communication is actually based on this flow of how we think through, how we attack a problem. And so what I want to do is to think about, okay, let's look at the steps that we think about in scientific method, and let's look at the sections of a paper, and let's figure out what goes where. So first of all, I've thrown in addition to the main four, I've thrown in the abstract and the references, because those show up in every paper. And so you can ask yourself, which parts of the scientific method go in the abstract? And the answer should be all of them, okay? The abstract is your little mini paper. We'll be talking about that towards the end of the quarter. But all of the parts of the scientific method should end up in the abstract, okay? So we'll tie back, and we'll look at that later when we do abstracts. Okay, but let's So let's ignore the abstract for now. I took out those arrows because it just made the whole thing wildly confusing. So let's think about, okay, if we, other than the abstract, when we are talking about the question that we're addressing with our research, where does that go? That goes in the introduction. So after we figure out the question we want to address, the first thing we do is not to do an experiment, but actually to do research and see what's already been done. And so we're basically doing a literature search. And where does that all go? That literature search ends up in the introduction. Now, does that literature search end up anywhere else? Well, it does. I mean, obviously it's going to go in references. And then I forgot to put it here, but you will see some of that tie back in the discussion as well. So put in your mind a little green arrow heading to the discussion. Okay, so then you come up with a hypothesis. Hypothesis is going to end up in the introduction. And so you probably noticed that when we were writing our proposals last quarter, that you were trying to format like research questions and the hypothesis that went in the background. Okay, so now you're going to experiment or make observations. And where do these show? Well, how you do your experiment ends up in the method section. And then what you observe as you do that experiment ends up in the results section. Okay, so that is actually a really big chunk. And I've actually seen scientific method things that break that down into little bits, observe/experiment. And that, you know, more closely corresponds to the section of the paper. All right, once you have your observations, your data, you then get to analyze your data, and all of the analysis is reported in the discussion section. So the results are what you saw, the discussion is you're analyzing what you saw and using that analysis to then draw a conclusion. Okay, so again, with a few minor exceptions, and that's the research, the lit search part, gets drawn into a few different sections. You're basically going through the steps of the scientific method within a paper. Okay, so this process, like I said before, it doesn't just apply in a paper, it applies in a poster, it applies in a oral presentation if you're doing that at a conference or somewhere. And the reason we do that is because we're walking people through the process that we used to come to our conclusions. And so basically, the way that we write a paper, and I will add to what's on the screen, that we give an oral presentation, that we present a poster, the way that we do that is by telling a story. But the story is not the sort of story, you know, that makes the New York Times bestseller list, right? We don't frame it the same way that we tell a campfire story. We frame it as a scientific story, as this is how we go through the scientific process. This is how we processed the question. This is where we actually got the question based on our knowledge of the literature. This is what the literature led us to suspect would happen if we did this experiment. That's a hypothesis. And then when we tried it, lo and behold, things didn't go the way that we thought they were going to go. Instead, they went this other way. And what we observed told us that, you know, such and such a thing was true. So there's all sorts of things that we are telling, but we're basically leading them through the process that brings us to the conclusion. And we do not write this. It's not at all like creative writing because of the way it's structured. So probably the biggest mistake I see when I see people trying to do scientific writing is to structure it like it's a story that they're telling to their nephew or something. But it's not that sort of story. You have to think of it as the way a scientist would think of it and tell the story that way. Now, you did do one other sort of scientific writing in last quarter, where it was not introduction, methods, results, discussion. So that was your proposal, right? Your NSF proposal that you wrote. And you might say, well, hey, so here's a piece of scientific writing that doesn't follow the normal structure. And I want to show you, first of all, you wrote an introduction section that had background material, right? And so again, that's going to be, your research, your questions, hello cat, your hypothesis, right? So that part's all the same. You had a method section, right? So that part was the same. But the part that you didn't have was the results and the discussion, right? Now, we kind of did things a little differently than usual because a lot of times the results, you actually will have a section that has preliminary results. We have often joked in the scientific community that it's kind of sad. You need to ask for funding, but you need to have results to ask for funding, but you can't get results until you have money to get results. So it's kind of this vicious cycle, but they generally like you to show some preliminary results so you can show that, you're heading down an alley that, is going to make sense to go down. So it's actually not uncommon to have a small amount of results in a funding proposal. And then for the discussion, there is no discussion because you don't have data. So there's no discussion the way we normally think of discussion. But what we do have is we have broader impacts, right? If I got this data, what would be the results for society, right? How would the results affect society? Which is something that you kind of want to put into a discussion section. Like, what is the impact of this data on the broader scientific community? And so that's the discussion section, right? It's kind of pre-thinking about the impact of your data, even though you don't have data. So even a funding proposal is trying, my cat is driving me crazy, is trying to follow this same basic structure. Okay. All right, so here's your assignment. What we're going to do, I've said that a paper, a poster, an oral presentation have the same basic structure. So it's really hard to get a hold of an oral presentation for you to look at. So I'm just going to say, pick a paper and a poster, and they don't need to cover the same things, just, that's not important. So find a paper, and once again, I'm encouraging you. I know that some of you have limited internet access, but I'm hoping that maybe you'll have some print copies of papers that you used last quarter that you could select from. So get one of these papers, and then look online for posters that have been presented at conferences. And so I'm going to encourage you to look at ResearchGate, because a lot of people upload their conference papers to ResearchGate. So if you know someone has presented at a conference, it's a good place to look. And then what I want you to do is to go through section by section. And so look at the introduction. Look at the introductions of the paper and the poster. And I want you to look at the difference in how information is presented in those two formats. First of all, does it have the things that I pointed out in this video? The hypothesis and the research questions and all that stuff. But also, just how is that information displayed? Okay, so I want you to become hyper aware of the differences between a poster and a paper. Because while it's true that each of these things has the same sections, we don't present the information necessarily the same way in each thing. And that's really important to know because I've definitely seen, let's say, oral presentations where people basically were treating it like a paper, like they were reading a paper. And that's not what we're shooting for, right? That's not effective. I've seen posters that look like someone took a paper and like moved it into columns and basically squished it onto a 36 by 48 sheet of paper, and that's also not the way things work. Okay, so I want you to be aware of the differences that you see, and so go through section by section the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. Go through each of those things and make notes about what you've seen and be ready to talk about these things in our discussion on Thursday. I will also have a place for you to record some of what you noticed on Canvas, and so look for that there. So that is what I want you to think about before Thursday, and so I will see you on Thursday.